July 26, 1944. 4:02 a.m., deep in the heart of Nazi-occupied Poland, the silence of the night is being murdered by the scream of two Pratt and Whitney engines. Inside the cockpit of a British Dakota, the pilot's knuckles are white. He pushes the throttles to the firewall. The airframe shudders, metal groaning against metal. Outside, the world is a sea of black, viscous mud. Jerzy Chmielewski, code name Raphael, clutches a heavy leather suitcase to his chest. His breath comes in ragged gasps. He looks out the small, scratched window. 10 kilometers to the west, an elite SS garrison is waking up. If they hear this noise, if a single German patrol decides to investigate this field, Jerzy won't just die. Poland's last hope will die with him. Inside that suitcase, and 18 others scattered across the floor of the plane, lies the greatest secret of the Third Reich. The vengeance weapon. Hitler's miracle. The V2 rocket. 8 months of blood. Hundreds of lives sacrificed. Engineers working by candlelight while the Gestapo hunted them from above. All of it, everything, is about to be buried in a nameless Polish field because of a summer rainstorm and a few inches of soft earth. The plane doesn't move. The wheels spin, digging deeper into the graveyard of mud. Jerzy closes his eyes. He remembers the faces of the men who didn't make it to this field. The partisans who died creating the diversion. The farmers who hid rocket parts under piles of rotting potatoes. He can almost smell the fear in the cabin. If this plane doesn't take off in the next 28 minutes, the protocol is brutal and clear. Burn everything. Destroy the suitcases. Execute the mission's failure. But if they fail, London burns. If they fail, the V2, a weapon no one on Earth knows how to stop, will rain down from the edge of space, moving faster than the speed of sound, obliterating entire city blocks before anyone even hears it coming. This is the story of Operation Most 3, a heist so insane, so mathematically impossible, that it shouldn't have worked. It's a tale of a man with a photographic memory, a rocket that fell from the sky but refused to explode, and a flight into history with no brakes and no hope. But to understand how we got stuck in this mud, we have to go back to the moment the world first felt the breath of Hitler's decisive weapon. To understand why Jerzy Chmielewski is risking everything in that mud, we have to look 1,500 kilometers to the west. London, June 13th, 1944. 4 a.m. The city is exhausted. For 4 years, Londoners have lived under the shadow of the Luftwaffe. They know the drill. The sirens wail, the searchlights pierce the clouds, and the heavy thrum of Heinkel bombers fills the air. It's a terrifying, but familiar, symphony of war. But this morning is different. A strange, high-pitched rattling sound, like a motorcycle with a broken muffler, streaks across the sky. Then, suddenly, the sound stops. Silence. For several agonizing seconds, the city holds its breath. Boom! A massive explosion rips through a residential street in Bethnal Green. 6 people are dead before they even realize the sirens never went off. This was the V1 flying bomb, the Vergeltungswaffe 1, Hitler's first vengeance weapon. It was a pulse-jet-powered cruise missile, crude, noisy, and slow enough for a Spitfire pilot to tip its wing and send it spiraling into the countryside. The V1 was a psychological terror, yes, but it was a threat the British could see, hear, and fight. But British intelligence, the MI6, had a dark realization. The V1 was just the appetizer. Something much worse, something that defied the known laws of aviation, was being fueled in the secret forests of occupied Europe. They called it the V2. If the V1 was a flying lawnmower, the V2 was a visitor from a nightmare future. Designed by the brilliant and morally complex Wernher von Braun, the V-2 was the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile. While the V-1 struggled at 400 miles per hour, the V-2 traveled at Mach 4. Think about the physics of that for a moment. When a V-2 was launched, it didn't fly through the air like a plane. It screamed into the stratosphere, reaching the edge of space, an altitude of 88 kilometers, before gravity pulled it back down in a parabolic arc of pure destruction. By the time it hit its target, it was traveling at nearly 2,900 miles per hour. That is 4 times the speed of sound. This meant 2 things for the people on the ground. First, it was invisible to radar of the time. Second, and most terrifyingly, you would be dead before you heard it coming. Because the rocket traveled faster than its own sound, the explosion happened first. Only after the blast would the survivors hear the sonic boom, a ghostly double crack echoing over the ruins of what used to be a neighborhood. There was no siren, no defense, no way to hide. When Wernher von Braun showed Adolf Hitler the first successful launch on color film, the Führer didn't just clap. He jumped from his chair, his eyes wide with a manic intensity. He shook von Braun's hand and declared, "This is the decisive weapon of the war. Humanity will never be able to endure it." Hitler wasn't just exaggerating for propaganda. He believed that if he could rain 1,000 of these silent killers on London every week, the British spirit wouldn't just bend, it would shatter. General Dwight D. Eisenhower would later admit in his memoirs, it seemed hopeless. If the Germans had succeeded in perfecting and using these weapons 6 months earlier, our invasion of Europe would have proved exceedingly difficult, perhaps impossible. Back in London, the Wizard War, the battle of wits between British scientists and Nazi engineers, was being lost. The British had no blueprints, no photographs, no captured engines. All they had were terrifying fragments of intelligence and the growing tally of dead civilians. They were fighting a ghost. And to stop a ghost, you need more than courage. You need the physical soul of the machine. You need to see its brain, the guidance system that tells it where to fall. The British War Cabinet issued a desperate, top-secret order to the Polish underground. Find us a V-2, intact, or London is lost. Which brings us back to the man with the photographic memory and a mission that should have been a suicide note. Warsaw, November 1943. A city under the boot. A place where every street corner is a potential gallows, and every shadow holds a secret. In a basement beneath the ruins of a church, a place the Gestapo wouldn't think to look, a group of men huddle around a map. These are the leaders of the Armia Krajowa, the Polish Home Army. To the world, Poland had been conquered in 1939, but the world was wrong. In the darkness, the Poles had built something unprecedented, an underground state. They had their own courts, their own schools, their own newspapers, and an army of 400,000 soldiers who wore civilian clothes by day and carried Sten guns by night. They had already done the impossible once. It was Polish mathematicians who first cracked the German Enigma code and handed the secrets to the British. It was Polish agents who infiltrated the top-secret Nazi facility at Peenemünde, leading to its destruction by 600 RAF bombers. But now, the British have sent a message that smells of desperation. The Germans have moved their rocket program. They are testing it somewhere in rural Poland. Find it. Now. The man assigned to lead this impossible hunt sits in the corner, almost invisible. Jerzy Chmielewski, codename Raphael. If you saw him on a Warsaw tram, you wouldn't remember him. He was 30 years old, of average height, with an unremarkable face. He didn't look like a hero. He didn't look like a spy. and that was his greatest weapon. But Jersey possessed a biological anomaly, a gift that was both a blessing and a curse, a photographic memory. Imagine this. Jersey could look at a complex technical diagram, a mess of wires, valves, and fuel lines, for just 60 seconds. He could then walk away, wait 3 months, and redraw that exact diagram on a blank sheet of paper with the precision of a master architect. In a world where carrying a single scrap of paper could get you tortured and executed by the Gestapo, Jersey was the ultimate hard drive. He carried no documents. He carried no evidence. He carried the secrets of the Reich inside his skull. But Raphael couldn't do this alone. To find a needle in a haystack, especially a needle that flies at Mach 4, he needed eyes everywhere. Jersey began to build his network, but he didn't recruit professional soldiers or elite commandos. He went to the people who knew the land better than anyone. He recruited foresters who knew every hidden trail in the deep Polish woods. He recruited railway workers who tracked the Sonderzug, special trains carrying mysterious, oversized cargo under heavy guard. He recruited farmers whose only qualification was that they looked at the sky more than they looked at the ground. He spoke to them with a brutal, chilling honesty. If the Germans perfect this weapon, London will fall. And if London falls, Poland is erased from the map forever. I cannot pay you. I cannot protect your families. If you are caught, you will die slowly in a basement in Warsaw. Will you help me? Almost no one said no. By December 1943, Jersey had created a ghost network. Dozens of ordinary people became the tripwires of an invisible trap. And then, the first reports started coming in. From the remote village of Blizna, deep in the southeastern forests, foresters reported massive clearings being carved out of the woods. Railway workers noted shipments of liquid oxygen, a fuel they had never seen used in such quantities. Then came the noise, a sound like the sky being torn in half. The rockets were there, but locating the launch site was only the beginning. Now, Raphael and his team of amateurs had to do something even more suicidal. They had to wait for a rocket to fail. They had to pray for a miracle. And on May 20th, 1944, the river bug gave them exactly what they needed. For months, Raphael's network had been playing a deadly game of wait and see. They watched the launches from Blizna, counting the seconds of flight, mapping the trajectories. They were waiting for a failure. Because in the world of experimental rocketry, failure is the only way to learn. On May 20th, 1944, the sky over the Bug River marshes provided the answer. A V-2 rocket rose from the forest at Blizna, but something was wrong. Instead of screaming toward the edge of space, the engine sputtered. The guidance fins flickered. The 12-ton beast groaned in midair, tilted, and began a terrifying, silent plunge toward the earth. It hit the marshland near the village of Sarnaki with a dull thud that shook the ground for miles. Jersey's local partisans were already moving before the smoke cleared. They knew the Germans would be there in minutes. The Luftwaffe would send spotter planes. The SS would bring trucks and dogs. But when the first Polish scouts reached the impact site, they saw something that defied logic. There, half buried in the black, foul-smelling mud of the swamp, lay 14 meters of sleek, black and white checkered steel. The V-2. It was intact. Why didn't it explode? In a twist of fate, the soft, peat-filled mud of the Bug River acted as a massive shock absorber. The rocket hadn't hit hard ground. It had been caught in a giant natural safety net. The partisans looked at the weapon of the future in silence. It looked like something from a Jules Verne novel. Cold, alien, and deadly. But they didn't have time for awe. The hum of a German Fieseler Storch spotter plane echoed in the distance. They couldn't move it. It weighed 12 tons. They didn't have cranes or heavy trucks. They only had their hands, their shovels, and their desperate ingenuity. Then came the order that saved the mission. Don't dig it out. Hide it. In a feat of collective strength, dozens of local farmers and partisans swarmed the site. They didn't use camouflage nets. The Germans would recognize those from the air. Instead, they used the swamp itself. They cut thousands of reeds and willow branches. They smeared the shiny metal hull with thick, black mud to kill the reflection of the sun. They moved with a rhythmic, frantic energy, working even as the German planes circled directly overhead. For the next 7 days, the marshes became a theater of the absurd. German search teams combed the banks of the river. Luftwaffe pilots flew so low they could see the ripples in the water. They knew the rocket had come down here. They had the coordinates. They had the technology. But they were looking for a 45-foot rocket. They weren't looking for a slightly elevated patch of reeds and mud. On the third day, a German patrol stood less than 10 meters from the buried nose cone. A young partisan, hidden in the tall grass with a grenade in his hand, held his breath. If the Germans took one more step, he would blow himself and the secret to pieces. The Germans looked at the swamp, cursed the mosquitoes, and turned back. After a week of fruitless searching, the Nazi commanders made a fatal assumption. They concluded that the rocket must have broken up mid-air and disintegrated into the deep mud of the riverbed. They called off the search. The moment the last German truck vanished over the horizon, Jerzy Chmielewski received the signal. The bird is ours. But now, the real challenge began. They had the rocket, but it was sitting in a swamp in the middle of a war zone. To get it to London, they had to do the unthinkable. They had to dismantle the most complex machine on the planet, piece by piece, under the nose of the Gestapo. And they had to do it in a barn. Imagine the scene. Outside, the village of Holofscheich is crawling with Gestapo agents. They are angry, humiliated, and desperate to find their missing miracle. They are checking every basement, every attic, every haystack. But just a few hundred yards away, inside a weathered wooden barn that smells of old hay and manure, the 20th century is being disassembled. This was the barn laboratory. Jerzy Chmielewski had summoned the finest minds of the Polish underground. Men like Professor Janusz Groszkowski, a world-class expert in radio electronics, and Antoni Kocjan, a brilliant glider constructor. These weren't soldiers. They were academics who had spent years operating in the shadows of the underground university. They stood before the V2, a 12-ton monster of duralumin and steel. They had no specialized tools, no clean rooms, no diagnostic computers. They worked by the flickering light of candles and kerosene lamps, knowing that at any moment, the barn doors could be kicked open by an SS raiding party. Under the guidance of Kocjan, the team began a reverse engineering process that should have taken months. They did it in weeks. They dismantled over 25,000 individual components. They mapped the combustion chamber, a masterpiece of engineering that burned a mixture of liquid oxygen and alcohol at temperatures that would melt ordinary steel. They analyzed the turbopumps, which spun at 4,000 revolutions per minute to feed the engine's insatiable hunger. But then, Professor Groszkowski found the Holy Grail. Inside the nose cone, nestled in a web of delicate wiring, sat the guidance system. This was the brain of the V2. The British feared the V2 used an autonomous, inertial guidance system, meaning once it was launched, it couldn't be stopped or diverted. If that were true, London was doomed. But as Groszkowski peered through his magnifying glass, his heart skipped a beat. He saw radio receivers. This was the Achilles heel. The V2 wasn't entirely autonomous. It was being steered by radio signals from the ground during its ascent. Groszkowski realized that if the Allies knew the exact frequencies the Germans were using, they wouldn't need to shoot the rocket down. They could simply blind it. They could jam the signal and send Hitler's pride and joy screaming into the empty North Sea instead of Piccadilly Circus. Every discovery was meticulously documented. Jerzy Raphael Chmielewski stood over the professors, his eyes darting across every blueprint, every chemical formula, every technical sketch. He wasn't just watching, he was scanning. His photographic memory was recording the 200-page report as it was being written. If the documents were burned, Jerzy would become the document. But they couldn't just leave 25,000 parts in a barn. They had to get the most critical components, the guidance, brain, the fuel injectors, the telemetry sensors, out of the kill zone. How do you move 50 kilograms of top-secret Nazi technology through a dozen Gestapo checkpoints? The Poles chose the most invisible camouflage in the world, the humble potato. The parts were packed into 19 nondescript leather suitcases. These cases were then buried at the bottom of horse-drawn carts, covered with layers of dirt, and topped with hundreds of pounds of rotting, mud-caked potatoes. For 2 months, these Potato Express convoys traveled across occupied Poland. Think about the nerves required for this. A farmer, a simple man named Jan, driving his cart toward a German checkpoint. An SS officer stops him, pokes a bayonet into the pile of potatoes. The steel blade passes just inches from a guidance valve that cost more than the entire village. The officer smells the rot, grimaces, and waves the cart through. He had no idea he had just allowed the salvation of London to drive right past him. By July 1944, the 19 suitcases had reached the edge of a secret landing strip. The cargo was ready. The brain of the V2 was ready. But there was one final obstacle: the mud. The summer rains had turned the Polish soil into a glue-like trap. And as the British Dakota touched down to pick up the prize, the mission didn't just slow down, it stopped. The wheels sank, the engine screamed, and the sun began to rise. July 26, 1944. 4:15 a.m. The eastern horizon is bleeding a faint, sickly blue. Dawn is no longer a concept, it is a predator. On the improvised landing strip, the British Dakota is a wounded beast. Its wheels are buried nearly a foot deep in the rain-soaked Polish earth. Every time the pilot, Flight Lieutenant Culliford, slams the throttles forward, the engines scream in protest, but the plane only vibrates. It's not flying, it's sinking. Inside the cabin, the air is thick with the smell of high-octane fuel and sweat. Jerzy Chmielewski looks at his watch. 20 minutes until the first German patrol arrives. 20 minutes until the mission ends in a firing squad. Then, the partisans start to move. They aren't soldiers anymore. They are laborers of the impossible. They sprint to nearby farms, tearing wooden planks from barn walls and ripping fence posts out of the frozen ground. They lay these boards in front of the wheels, trying to create a wooden road through the muck. Others are on their hands and knees, literally digging the mud away from the landing gear with their bare fingers. Culliford tries again. Full power. The planks crack like gunshots under the weight. The Dakota lurches forward 6 inches, then stops. The mud is too strong. It has a vacuum-like grip on the tires. This is the moment of the impossible choice. Culliford looks at his co-pilot, Kazimierz Schreier, a Pole who has flown 20 bombing missions over Germany. He knows the aircraft, he knows the physics of flight, and he knows they are too heavy. "Cut the lines," Culliford orders. It sounds like madness. He's talking about the hydraulic brake lines. In a Dakota, the hydraulic system controls the brakes and the landing gear. If they cut the lines, they reduce the internal pressure that might be locking the brakes in the mud. But it means more than that. It means if they actually manage to take off, they will have no way to stop when they land. Schreier doesn't hesitate. He crawls under the fuselage with a combat knife. One swift motion. Red hydraulic fluid sprays into the mud like blood. The nervous system of the plane is severed. They are committed. "Everyone out!" Jersey shouts. They dump everything. Extra fuel cans, luggage, supplies. Anything that isn't a V2 part is tossed into the swamp. The plane is lighter, bleeding and desperate. 4:32 a.m. The sun is touching the tops of the trees. Culliford guns the engines one last time. The roar is deafening. The partisans throw their weight against the wings, pushing with every ounce of strength left in their bodies. The Dakota groans. It slides across the cracking wooden planks. It hits the soft mud. The engine screaming at the red line. The tail lifts. The nose lifts. And then, the miracle of lift. The wheels leave the mud with a sound like a wet slap. The plane clears the tree line by less than 10 feet, its belly scraping the leaves. They are airborne. But the nightmare isn't over. It's just moved to the sky. As they climb over the Carpathian Mountains, a new crisis emerges. Because the hydraulic lines were severed, the landing gear won't retract. The wheels are stuck hanging halfway out, creating massive aerodynamic drag. They are burning fuel twice as fast as calculated. They are flying low, dodging German radar, over territory crawling with Messerschmitt fighters. The flight engineer spends the next 4 hours doing something insane. He gathers every liquid on the plane, drinking water, leftover tea from thermoses, even urine, and pours it into the dry hydraulic reservoir, hoping to build enough pressure to lock the wheels. 11:40, Ulm, Brindisi, Italy, Allied territory. The control tower receives a frantic radio call. Dakota coming in, carrying most 3 cargo. No brakes. Repeat. No brakes. Request emergency strip. The ground crew scatters. Fire trucks race to the runway. They know what a no-brake landing looks like. It usually ends in a fireball. Culliford lines up the approach. He has one shot. He has to touch down at the very beginning of a sand-covered emergency runway, using the friction of the sand to do what the machine no longer can. The tires hit the sand at 100 miles per hour. The plane fishtails violently. Jersey grips his suitcase so hard his fingernails draw blood from his palms. The end of the runway, and a concrete barrier, is rushing toward them. The plane slows. 80 miles per hour, 50 miles per hour, 20 miles per hour. It stops exactly 20 meters from the edge. The door creaks open. The heat of the Italian sun hits Jersey's face. He steps onto the tarmac, trembling, still clutching the suitcase. British officers run toward him, reaching for the cargo. But Jerzy Chmielewski pulls back. He refuses to hand it over. Not to a stranger. Not yet. He had carried this secret through mud, fire, and a brakeless flight from hell. He would only give it to the man he trusted. The heist was over. But the war for the V2 had just moved into the laboratory. Within 48 hours of landing in Italy, the 19 suitcases were on a high-priority flight to London. The Wizard War had moved into its final, decisive phase. In the laboratories of the British Air Ministry, scientists, led by the legendary intelligence expert R.V. Jones, pored over the blueprints and components Jersey had brought them. They didn't just see metal and wires, they saw the blueprint of Hitler's defeat. The discovery of the radio guidance receivers changed everything. When the Germans launched their first operational V2 rockets against London in September 1944, they expected a massacre. They expected the city to surrender in weeks. But they didn't know about the potato heist. Along the British coast, massive transmitters were already standing by. As the V2s climbed through the atmosphere, British operators flooded the German frequencies with white noise and deceptive signals. The rockets, blinded by the intelligence Jersey and his team had gathered, veered off course. Hundreds of them fell harmlessly into the cold waters of the North Sea. Every rocket that splashed into the ocean was a street in London that remained standing. every jammed signal was 1,000 lives saved. But what was the price of this victory? While the bells of London eventually rang in celebration of VE Day, the 200 partisans who stood in that muddy field were facing a new, darker nightmare. The Soviet Red Army swept through Poland, not as liberators, but as new masters. Stalin feared the Polish Home Army. Men and women who had proven they could outsmart the Gestapo were seen as a threat to communist rule. Many of the heroes of Operation Most 3 were hunted down, not by the Germans, but by the NKVD. Captain Kabat, the man who coordinated the defense of the landing strip, was arrested and spent years in Soviet prisons. The farmers who tore down their barns to free the plane. Many were labeled Western spies and vanished into the gulags of Siberia. The engineers who worked by candlelight? Their contributions were erased from the official history books of the People's Republic of Poland. And Jerzy Chmielewski, the man with the photographic memory? He lived out his days in exile in London. He worked quietly, a ghost among the millions he had saved. He never asked for a medal. He never wrote a best-selling memoir. He carried the images of that muddy field, the faces of his fallen friends, and the 25,000 parts of a rocket inside his mind until the day he died in 1966. The world forgot about Operation Most 3 for decades. It was a secret kept too well. But history has a way of rising from the mud. Today, we look at the V-2 not just as a weapon of terror, but as the ancestor of the Apollo rockets that took humanity to the moon. But we must never forget that the path to the stars was paved by the blood of ordinary people in a nameless Polish swamp. Sometimes, the impossible doesn't require a superpower. It just requires a man with a memory, a farmer with a horse, and the courage to say no to a tyrant, even when the world is burning. History is often written by the victors, but the most important stories are often hidden in the suitcases of the silent. If you believe these 200 heroes deserve to be remembered, hit the like button and share this video. It's the only way their story stays alive. And if you want to see more deep dives into the secret heists that changed the world, subscribe and turn on notifications. What would you have done if you were standing in that mud? Let me know in the comments. Because sometimes, the only thing standing between a city and destruction is a few wooden planks and a lot of courage.